I'm gonna cut Peter from the feed just for a second while he gets that reconnected and set back up. All right, David Singer and House Bear Forge. I see your guys' questions. We're gonna get to those. Um, that's a pretty funny comment. Not just north, but magnetic north, right? Yeah, because magnetic north is different from uh, geographic north. Oh, la, la. Let's see. So House Bear Forge is asking, as a new knife maker uh, and engineer, I'm starting to take a deep dive into the metallurgy of moving steel, pattern welding, and wootz. Any recommendations for books and learning the technical aspect? And then David Singer is asking about. Um, I know Peter, he just came back, but you guys can't see him. But I think he can hear me. So he's getting his headset connected and looking super handsome. Whenever, Peter, you think you got it connected again, give me a thumbs up. Let's see. All
right. So good book. Functions of alloying elements in steel. Edgar Colin Bain. And, so that's a good place to start. John Verhoeven has done both. I think if you dig around, you can find a pretty good PDF that he did. If you dig around on the internet, he did a pretty good basic metallurgy for bladesmiths.
right.
Yeah. He has also written. He did do a book kind of summarizing the Crucible Steel work that he did with Pendray. So, and then, folks who are really interested, there is, of course, the Knife Steel Nerds with Laren Thomas and his book that he did. I haven't actually read the book. I have certainly. I've read some of his articles, and some of them. I'm like, the great article. Other ones, it's not so much a matter of feeling like it's not a good article, but it's not pointed at what I'm interested in.
Sure.
I feel like so to me, the performance of blades is very interesting. I definitely find that interesting, but I don't have a huge interest in what is the absolute hardest steel, or what is the steel that has the highest edge retention. I am far more interested in functionality. So for example, if we look at, if we look at a single gauge of performance, that very often isn't going to actually get us to a good blade. Aside from the fact that, what constitutes a good blade, typically, a good blade is based on, obviously, the steel in it, but did you do a good heat treat on that steel? And is your geometry good? And then is your overall knife design good? Do you have a good overall functionality? And are all those elements well suited to the steel that you're using? So if a knife maker has a design that they've, let's say essentially perfected, they've done the same design or, very similar style using one steel. And then they're like, you know what, I'm going to switch to their, this high performance steel. It can often backfire because the high performance steel doesn't work the same way. It's a whole different beast, so maybe the geometry that worked really well, let's say you've been using 1084, which is like, one of the best all around steels for knife makers. If you've been using that and you've perfected your design with that, and now you try to switch to one of the super high performance steels that's out there, let's say a customer asks you to do this, because we know customers do that.
Yes, they do.
And maybe it is actually like a complete piece of shit at that point, because the performance is so different, like the characteristics of the steel are so different. And kind of an example that I often give when I'm trying to talk customers off the ledge in some sense, for that kind of stuff, is that if you purchase a Lamborghini and you live in New York City,
Yeah,
there's an absolute mismatch. Like you've got this performance that is absolutely not going to help you in New York City.
sure.
And in fact, it could be a detriment to you. That having this Lamborghini is not a positive; it's a negative. So that's where I run into problems with ranking steels particularly by one element of performance.
Sure.
Because it doesn't mean that it's the best steel. It certainly doesn't mean it's the best steel for every situation, but it means that it doesn't tell you whether it's the best steel for a given design, or whether for that matter, will you, as the end customer, will this person ever actually, I guess, have access to that performance? So like,
Right.
if I have a steel that's got amazing edge holding ability, like it's super abrasion resistant, excellent edge holding ability, if you're not using it constantly, then corrosion is actually what's going to affect your edge the fastest, not
Sure.
abrasion. You're not, your knife's not going to dull because you've cut so many things with it. Your knife's going to dull just from generalized oxidation from the atmosphere. So all that extra, edge holding ability is completely wasted in that scenario.
Sure.
If you're going to be using this knife to open letters at your desk, then and some people love to do this. They love to spend an extra $5,000 to achieve what the $30 knife from Walmart would do, because then they can tell people, hey, look what I did.
Sure.
To me, that, and again, this is very much my personal take on it. To me, that's useless performance. You're paying money, you're paying a lot of extra money for performance that you can't access. It's essentially imaginary performance. It's performance in your head, and that's it's like a fantasy football league of knives.
Right.
My knife is 62 Rockwell and it's made from this steel, and I'm going to give you all the specs of it. Oh no, but wait, we'll compare it in this head-to-head analysis of this other steel and this other knife that's this Rockwell. It's like, why don't you take your two knives, go out and do some real shit with them? Go out, use them in the kitchen, do it, use them for what they're supposed to be used for. And is it a good knife then? And that's where my real interest comes in, is like, how does it function in reality,
right.
rather than comparison of statistics. So I think that and I guess I want to be very clear that I'm not saying there's something wrong with that. It's just not what interests me.
Sure.
That's so that's why I haven't been, I don't follow Laren's work super closely.
Yeah.
Certainly when I'm doing research, trying to figure out something, in metallurgy, very often his articles pop up, and I always enjoy reading them. But it's not something that I sit around thinking about a lot.
Sure.
Just because there is kind of that vein to it. What is the most in this particular, the most exciting in this particular
Sure.
single characteristic. So that rant aside.
Yeah. Well, while we're on,
that was the short answer to the question of where can you go for technical info.
We got another question here from Jorian. I think I'm saying that right. Yeah, Jorian Nippenberg. He says, "Incredible work, Peter. Could you explain how you can control the wootz pattern in melting, solidification, forging, and heat treatment? How do you control carbon content and alloying content in your wootz?" And then he also asked, "How do you get your Mokame Gane bonds strong enough for mosaic techniques?"
Well, so I'll start at the end.
Okay.
And that's to say that the mokame that I'm working on right now, doing the mosaic mokame, it's still a work in progress, and so that little tidbit is that's not going out in the world yet. It is, I will say that not everybody has actually noticed that it's mosaic. A lot of folks look at it and are like,
So
"Oh,
hat
that's
tip to
pretty sweet mosaic. It's great."
Yeah, hat tip to Jorian for noticing that.
Yeah, well, exactly. Certainly not everybody has noticed that. It is definitely a very specific process. One thing I will say, so I'm using pure nickel and pure copper, or as close to that as one can get. And nickel and copper are, as much as they're, nickel in particular, relatively expensive material. But it's a good place to start in mokame because both materials deoxidize themselves once you get to a high enough temperature. I'm firing my mokame at about 1,000 degrees centigrade. And at that temperature, both nickel and copper, the oxides break down and reduce back to being the pure metals.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I'm sure if you had
1950, right?
Sure. Sounds great.
Sorry, 1832.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say, some things I only work in centigrade because, ironically, the kind of cheap thermocouple that I bought off Amazon, once you go above 1999 Fahrenheit, it just reads as 1 in Fahrenheit. So above that temperature, I have to work in centigrade.
Yeah.
So generally for forging work, that stuff, I most of that I know the centigrade temperatures for, versus like tempering and critical temperature. I mostly know that in Fahrenheit, so it's a weird split.
Yeah.
But either case, at that temperature, both copper and nickel are essentially self-reducing. So as long as you have a pretty good control over your atmosphere, they'll bond quite easily.
Nice.
So that's that I'm absolutely happy to put out there for folks who are playing with mokame, just starting to get into it. Copper is great to work with. Pure silver, as much as it's expensive, also generally speaking, pretty good to work with. Pure nickel, pretty good to work with. Once you get into the alloys, like, obviously you can do mokume using some of the different brass and bronze alloys, but they tend to be trickier. They're cheaper to work with.
They don't
They're much less expensive materials, but you're much more likely to screw it up.
Sure.
So not, and not necessarily just in the bonding. They're also fussier when it comes to forging.
Sure.
So mokume wise, that's at least something.
For sure.
On as to how I control the chemistry of my ingots, it's really it comes down to what goes into the crucible. I built a spreadsheet that makes it easy for me to calculate what the chemistry is of all the things that I'm putting in, and it kind of calculates what should come out the other end. And especially, working with a lid on the crucible, it's going to come out pretty close to that. There are certain elements that might change a little bit. So like, if I'm mostly adding carbon using pig iron, which is basically it's a close relative of cast iron. I'm using a high quality pig iron called sorrel metal. You can get actually most iron foundries here in the United States. A lot of them carry or use sorrel metal. So if you go to an iron foundry or call up an iron foundry, especially places that are doing malleable iron, which is, it's a tighter chemistry to make malleable iron versus gray cast iron. And they very often have it, and you can buy it. It's cheap. And little tidbit on the sorrel metal, it comes, pig iron. The reason they call it pig iron is because it's cast in a way that, all these little ingots are coming off a single runner. So people thought it looked like pigs suckling on their mom. So that's why it's called pig iron. So each one is called pig. But the pig ingots are, they're these big awkward things. They're, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 pounds, something like that. So not huge, but big enough to be awkward. And they're a really weird shape. And the thing about it is you typically are only going to be using a small piece. And it's ridiculously hard. So do not try to cut it with any kind of saw. Definitely not a band saw. Abrasive saws, it'll eat them up. It's gnarly stuff, because when it cools, so it's 4.25% carbon.
Wow. Okay.
And to give you and that's by weight, to give you an idea, pure iron carbide is only 6.66% carbon or something like that. So
Right.
a good chunk of that is carbide, like 2/3 of that brick is carbide. So almost anything that you, or graphite. But generally speaking, in a cast iron, or in this case, in the pig iron, where it's going to be remelted. So they don't care what the exact, what the structure of it is, or what, whether you've got graphite or carbides in there. So it's pretty gnarly. So the easiest way to do this, you put it in your forge, you heat it up to a nice bright red, and then you quench it in water, and it will tear itself apart
from the stress.
And then you can easily, it'll fracture, pieces will fall off of it. And then you can just use a little hammer and be like, twink, and take chunks off it.
Right. Okay. That's a good
And
tip.
if you try to break it without doing that, there's a good chance you'll hurt yourself, because it is so hard that when you break pieces off, there will be small pieces, small shrapnel that comes off there at crazy speeds.
Okay.
In my initial, the first time I was trying to break down one of these pigs, I tried various different things, and I ended up with little chunks embedded in the wall. So, and they've got like razor sharp edges on them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, heat it up, quench it, way easier, way easier.
Right.
But yeah, so if you are trying to add carbon, strictly by adding charcoal, that's it's more traditional. It definitely gets to be a little friskier, just because charcoal actually has variable carbon content, because it typically, it's not quite 100% carbon. If you burn charcoal, you do end up with ash. That ash is mineral content, essentially. So it's calcium, silica, whatever. But more importantly, charcoal absorbs moisture from the atmosphere. So it's a little hard, if you're weighing your charcoal, it's a little tricky to know how much of that weight is actually carbon. So some folks, rather than using charcoal, will use graphite. And if you're going to use graphite, I would strongly suggest that you don't use graphite powder. Graphite powder floats very easily on the slag, because you will always have, you'll always want to have some glass slag in there. And yeah, so charcoal or graphite powder, it's very easy for it to float out on the slag. So a lot of folks use, they'll buy like flake graphite, or even like little blocks of graphite, which again, these days, very easy to pick up these things. You can buy stuff on Amazon. Just in general, graphite is pretty available. Just make sure that you're getting a good quality, because graphite, depending on what it's being used for, the purity is going to vary somewhat. So that kind of covers the carbon side. I know what's going in, and especially, like I said, using a closed crucible, I can be pretty confident that what I put in there ends up in my steel. I'm not losing it to the atmosphere. The only real variable on carbon content is actually the crucible itself. The crucibles that I'm using are clay graphite crucibles, and it says it right in the name. Part of what's in that crucible is graphite. And also recently I've learned that clay graphite crucibles always contain a small amount of silicon carbide. Silicon carbide will dissolve instantly into molten iron. It's very fast. And it has the extra downside that not only are you going to be picking up extra carbon, but you're also going to be picking up extra silicon. And generally speaking, you don't want to be just, pumping up your silicon content for most steels. So, for me, I happen to know roughly how much carbon and a little bit of silicon that I pick up from the crucible, and that's a front I'm working on. Either crucibles that I won't pick up anything from, or coatings I can do on the inside of the crucible. But again, like I was talking about earlier, crucibles that will hold molten iron, not every crucible will do it. Now, there are a lot of materials that break down pretty quickly in the presence of molten iron. So, and that's just because iron, it's kind of like water. Many things are soluble in water. Many things are soluble in iron. So like, and it's different than, like copper. Not a lot of things are actually soluble in copper.
Okay.
So you don't run into the same kinds of problems. Like carbon, not at all soluble in copper. What crucible you use does affect how much control you have over the end product. You can make perfectly good ingots using, having no lid on your crucible, especially if you're working in a propane-fired furnace for 15 years, 16 years. I did almost entirely open-top melts. And that was partly because I could, I was working in propane, and partly because that way I could use a little steel rod and poke around in there and know that I had a fully molten, that everything had melted. I didn't have any little bits left over. Because that was a frustration that I ran into on numerous occasions, where I'd get this ingot, looks good, forge it out, and then start grinding into it, and then discover that there are these little pockets of, unmelted materials. There's like little chunks of steel still in there, and they're super high carbon now, but because they never completely melted, they don't have pattern, and so they just be these blank spots.
Interesting.
But having said that, once you have a good sense of how long it takes to for your steel to melt, have that process figured out, and you can just go by timing, then put a lid on the crucible. It doesn't have to seal. It's absolutely, you don't want it to be sealed. If it was sealed, the thing would blow up when you heated it. So you're not trying to seal it. You just want a cap on there that helps to separate the furnace atmosphere from the crucible atmosphere.
I got you.
It's very much like doing canister Damascus. Canister Damascus works great, not because it's perfectly sealed, because again, if it was perfectly sealed, it would blow up.
Right.
But instead, you, as it starts to heat, you develop positive pressure inside the canister, and that positive pressure keeps the forge atmosphere out. Same thing happens with the crucible. It's during the entire heating process, the crucible, first of all, you're just heating the gases, so they're expanding, so you get positive pressure. But then beyond that, there are chemical reactions going on, so there is always gas coming out of the crucible. So it maintains positive pressure, even if that lid is just kind of sitting on there. It does make it makes for more consistent ingots, and generally speaking, higher quality ingots.
With the cap on? What makes for a more consistent or more quality ingot is having a cap on?
Having a cap.
Right.
Having a cap on the crucible.
Right.
And what I use for the most part is I use the bottoms of old crucibles because they do wear out. So I just cut them off. It sits on there. Works great. Depending on where you buy your crucibles from, some places actually sell lids that match the crucible. So like there are really two places I buy crucibles from. It's actually Rio Grande Jewelry Supply. They sell salamander clay graphite crucibles, and Legend Mining Supply in Nevada. Which, if you're into anything related to mining or panning for gold or anything like that, they've got you covered. They have weird stuff. It's kind of fun dig around there. But they also sell the exact same crucibles, and pricing between the two places is similar. It generally just kind of comes down to shipping. How much you're going to pay for shipping. Which, being here in Hawaii, how much I pay for shipping it's very key. I need to know that. So, but yeah, and then as to other alloy levels, certain alloys, I try to control pretty closely. So like manganese, I really want to bring that manganese level down. Keep that fairly low. It's not. If you look at commercial steels, you'll see that there's a pretty firm inverse relationship between carbon content and manganese content. So like mild steel has, very high, it's like 0.8, 0.9% manganese. Is way up there. And actually, depending on where you are, like some other areas of the world, that manganese content in mild steel is over 1%. Whereas if we look at, say, 1095 versus 1075, so those are two steels that people use fairly frequently.
Sure.
Or at least are more familiar with. 1075 is typically a much higher manganese content than 1095. The manganese content of 1095, you drop off to like 0.4 to 0.5% manganese, whereas 1075, I think, is like 0.8% manganese. So just a note, if you're making pattern welded steel, don't go for the 1095. If you want that really nice black, go for the 1075. And also, if you're a person who uses 1084, check your 1084 source. Make sure, because 1084 basically is that designation. It's not a specific chemistry. It's saying we're taking 1080 and we're doing something specific to it. So you can buy 1084 that has been made, for knife makers, very often 1084 has been made to develop good hamons. And for hamons, you want low hardenability, you want low manganese. Whereas other 1084 actually has a pretty high manganese level because they want it to be more hardenable.
Right.
Generally speaking, though, if you look at steels that are hyper-eutectoid, so they're more than 0.75, 0.8% carbon, as you move up from there, the manganese level drops. And I haven't been able to find specific information on why this is, but higher manganese levels cause brittleness in hyper-eutectoid steels. Which is why 1095, that you go from 1075, which is roughly eutectoid, to 1095, and that manganese level has plummeted. And then you go to like W2, and you've gone from 0.45 roughly down. I think manganese, or I think the manganese level in W2 is like 0.3 or something to that effect. It's dropped it even further. Some of the very high alloy steels will have higher manganese levels combined with higher carbon levels. But that's because almost all of that carbon is getting sucked up as alloy carbides. So effectively, the carbon content is actually lower. The available carbon content is lower than it looks.
Sure.
So I saw that David Singer had asked whether I've done any cutting tests. I didn't, quite honestly, I don't recognize tested by Carta cutting tests. I'm not.
I think he meant Catra.
Catra. Okay. Which I've heard, but you know what that is, right?
I do.
Okay, well, you tell me, and I'll
Okay,
I
so
can tell you that none of my wootz blades have been sent off
sure.
for cutting tests.
Yeah, so these catcher tests, it's a specific cutting test designed to determine edge retention. And so
Okay.
at a certain point, and it's cardstock, and the cardstock has a specific amount of silica in it or something like that. So it's actually somewhat abrasive material that it's cut, not just the fibrous paper, but also actual abrasive in the paper
Right.
to a certain level. And so it's figuring out, how, and then somebody has to designate, all right, what is the range that you're going to work in to where there's no resistance to a certain amount of resistance. And once it gets to that certain amount of resistance, that's when you say, okay, that test is done. And
Right.
so that's how from what I understand, that's how these catcher tests work, and that they, and they're just trying to figure out edge. I think it's wear resistance
Right.
along the edge. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so A, good for me to know that, and B, I can say that at least none of my wootz blades have been tested in that fashion. I am kind of, along with the videos that I'm hoping to put out soon on, some of performance in phosphorus steels. I am actually working on doing a full battery of tests for wootz blades. I'm going to call it loosely based on the ABS test.
Okay.
So testing, can you, in a wootz blade, make it to, do this series of things and come out the other end, still cutting well. I've modified the test a little bit, just because, not to say that you can't put a razor edge on wootz, because you can, but the nature of the edge is, the nature of the material is such that it's not really suitable. You wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to have a wootz razor, because it cuts differently than other steels.
Sure.
There is, no matter what, a little bit more texture to the edge. So, for example, the will it shave hair off your arm aspect of the test is not going to be included in my series of tests. But planning on kind of running a wootz blade through so that people can, and this is the thing, is this is not, I'm not going to come out and be like, oh, well, wootz can do whatever any other steel can do, because I don't think that's true. But it's more, the thing I like about the ABS test, there are ways to kind of hack the test in some ways, but it is a test of all around performance.
Sure.
And and it's doing things, not to say that we cut free hanging ropes in our day-to-day lives, but they're tests that are stand-ins for things that might actually get done with a knife.
Sure.
And so I feel like that's, having tests like that to me is it is more valuable to the end user, to the customer, than a test that maybe focuses in on a specific aspect.
Sure.
So, for example, the Catra test for edge retention. That's a great test to do if you have different blades or different steels that or even probably more specifically, if you have one steel and you've heat treated it 5 different ways, and you want to now look at which one of these heat treats actually gave me the best product. Which one gave me the best structure in the steel? And that's good, valuable information. And that's where a test like that's really going to come in handy.
Yeah.
But I think that the overall performance tests are more valuable if a person is just looking at, hey, is this steel going to do what I want it to do?
Sure.
But again, I think most steels, if you talk to knife makers, at least knife makers who are being honest, whether that's honest with you or honest with themselves, the quality of the knife is only partly tied to the quality of the steel. The quality of the heat treat, did you heat treat this well, is a much bigger factor. So sure. If I'm very good at heat treating 1080 and, now somebody says, oh, make this for me in D2, if I don't know how to heat treat D2, then it doesn't matter whether, D2 is a better steel on paper, which, arguable one way or the other. But the 1080 knife is actually going to be the better knife.
Sure.
From me.
Yeah.
Go to somebody who all they do is D2, maybe they've really nailed their heat treat on D2. And, so then you get a whole different beast. I guess there's a lot of focus on what's the ultimate steel, and that kind of ignores the fact that, there's a definite human element.
There's definitely a human element. What is the person doing with that material?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Gonna circle back around very quickly to the person who was asking about alloy levels in the wootz.
Jorian.
Yeah. So I for vanadium, I have been, for the most part in my experiments, kind of mostly playing with vanadium contents, carbon contents. For my vanadium content in the steel, I'm actually using vanadium carbide powder. You can buy it as an abrasive powder, and vanadium carbide's really easy because it is chemically just one vanadium and one carbon. So it's pretty straightforward to look at the relative weight of the two atoms and figure out what proportion is carbon and what proportion is vanadium, because obviously, one atom of each, but they don't weigh the same amount. And in steel, almost everything is done by weight percentage rather than atomic percentage. If you look at the iron carbon phase diagram, which I think you've got that. Got an image of that. So the iron carbon phase diagram, down at the very bottom, they often show carbon percent by weight, carbon percent by atomic percent. So what percentage of the atoms are carbon atoms? And then this chart, which I find to be a particularly useful one, also shows us cementite or iron carbide percent by weight, and also iron carbide percent by mole percent, which is basically to say by how many units of iron carbide do you have in there. And for wootz in particular, where if you're looking for that visual pattern, that percentage of cementite of iron carbide, that's a really handy piece of information to have. So, but just that little piece of advice, if you're looking for vanadium to add to a melt, easiest way to get it that I've found is vanadium carbide powder. It's not widely available, but it is available. And you're probably going to be using it in really tiny amounts. So I feel like I bought a couple 100 grams for a little over $100. And, that's been 2 years ago. I'm still working on that first bag.
Right.
And quite honestly, it's a good way to look for metals that you're going to be adding to a melt. So like let's say, for example, somebody decided they wanted to add titanium to their melt. You can buy titanium carbide powder again pretty easily. If you try to add titanium to your melt as just the pure metal, there's a pretty good chance that it's just going to oxidize and disappear. And you're going to lose most of the titanium that you tried to put in. So the titanium carbide is going to work out better for you in that situation.
Interesting. Okay. We got another question here from Jason Elkins. He says, for those of us that would like to dabble in wootz and maybe don't know where to start in regards to getting the heat necessary to do so, what are your recommendations? I've been eyeing induction forges as a means to do so along with forging, etc. Is this something you've experienced with? So I guess what do you advise as a good resource? And really quick, I'll add, you've talked about your videos. You're on your YouTube channel.
Yep.
What's the name of your channel?
I went super simple when I left Dragon's Breath. Everything just became Peter Burt knives.
Okay.
So that's what I am on Instagram. That's what the YouTube channel is. It's that's what my email address is. I tried to keep it simple.
On your channel though, you do talk about your forges and the burners and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of good resources in those wootz videos because you've done wootz melt in the videos.
Yeah, they're pretty dry, but they are they're pretty dry, but there's definitely a lot of good info in there. So what I'm using currently is a hybrid burner that uses propane and diesel fuel. So it preheats with just propane, and then at a certain point, I open up a valve, and the propane actually feeds the diesel fuel and at least partly atomizes it. And the diesel fuel burns very, very differently. It has a much very high carbon content in diesel, and so it burns with a very, very luminous flame. And I have found that intriguingly, that very bright, so you're not going to get at least I never get that nice blue flame. Everybody tells you that blue flame is the hottest, which maybe it is, but in terms of actually putting heat into your material, a blue flame is actually not super efficient. You have to have heat enter your crucible strictly through conduction. So
is the infrared light playing a role in that?
It really, because infrared light, it does eventually, but really only after you heat the walls of your furnace.
Sure.
So obviously we can't see infrared light, but you can feel infrared light. And if you think about, how much heat you feel, radiant heat you feel coming off of say, a campfire versus coming out of your forge when you first start it. So when you first start your forge, and things, and the walls haven't heated, the flame, there's no radiant heat coming off that blue flame. If you take the burner, if you have a forge that you can take the burner out and have that burner operate independently, and you put your hand beside that blue flame, there's a little bit of radiant heat, but a white flame, a yellow or white flame, you get a lot more radiant heat off of that. So I have found that the diesel flame, which is, because of that carbon in there, it's a very luminous flame. It's extremely efficient at heating. I don't know that it's necessarily any hotter, but using propane, I used to struggle with getting the necessary temperature. It will definitely get there, but it's very, very dependent on the efficiency of your furnace, the refractory of your furnace. You have to have very, very efficient refractory lining, and generally speaking, it needs to be pretty clean. If it's gotten completely slagged out, you'll get a lot less radiant energy off of it. Whereas with the diesel, it almost doesn't matter. I actually, so I finally put a thermocouple in, or pyrometer and thermocouple hookup on my wootz furnace, and generally, so the temperature you have to hit is 1450 to 1500 Celsius.
Just convert that real quick.
Yeah, toasty. It's like 2600, 2700 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that.
Yeah, 1450 is 2642.
Yeah. So, and so if you think about what we get in our forges, they happily get up to 2350, 2400, something like that. They happily get to that point. Getting that extra couple hundred degrees with propane can be tough. Whereas with the diesel, I went from having problems with consistently getting the temperature I wanted, to instead, once I put a thermocouple in there, realizing that I was overshooting the temperature by a good margin. I don't know how much I was overshooting. Basically, I had been given information that you really don't want to get past 1600 Celsius, because at that temperature,
it's 29.
Silicon. Yeah, so silicon dioxide. So I think it's a dioxide. In any case, silica, what makes up the slag, because it's glass and glass is mostly silica, silica will actually spontaneously break down into silicon and enter your steel. Okay. So there's a very real reason to not want to go past 1600 degrees. And it's actually really your best bet in making wootz is to, get up to that sort of window, between say 1525 and 1575, and kind of hang out there.
Sure.
Because that's hot enough. That's hot enough to melt iron. So in some sense, I guess to some degree, you don't have to get that hot, but your furnace is almost always going to have to be a little bit hotter than, what the temperature inside the crucible is. But yeah, so I just, the very first time that I fired the furnace with that thermocouple in there, I pretty quickly realized that I had definitely been overshooting my temperature, and so now I'll run up to where I want to be, and then I actually have to turn the burner down to as low as it will go, and remain stable. And that luckily holds me right where I want to be. But,
sure.
And at this point, to do a wootz melt, I use a gallon to a gallon and a half of diesel fuel, and again, like a gallon of propane. So, a quarter.
Sounds like about $10 fuel.
I'll use between a quarter and half of a little barbecue bottle to do a wootz melt. So a big advantage of that is, it's a little bit more complicated to build the burner.
Sure.
But, the fuel savings there, the money, the straight up money savings there are it's pretty astonishing. Theoretically, you can use, I could use vegetable oil or biodiesel to do that. I could use waste oil to do that. I suggest not using waste oil because waste oil typically has, from oil changes in cars, typically has a lot of funky stuff in there. Not only it's got a pretty high sulfur content, but it also, you've got metals from the wear and tear inside the vehicle. So right. I really don't suggest doing that. And I've done a little bit with vegetable oil. The real downside there is that you don't know what the exact chemistry of it is.
Okay.
So with a crucible with a lid on it, you're probably not going to be picking up elements from the furnace atmosphere. It's probably not going to end up in the steel.
Sure.
But it is not worth playing with, to my mind, anyways. Because like both phosphorus and particularly sulfur being a major problem, that iron will suck sulfur right out of a forge atmosphere. That's why using coal to forge knives, you have to be careful that you've got a good quality coal.
I see.
If you have a high sulfur coal, you will actually just pick up you'll pick up sulfur right from the gases as it's burning.
Sure.
As to induction,
how does that setup compare to an induction forge, and what can an induction forge do?
So at Dragon's Breath Forge in Connecticut, we had a 15 kilowatt induction forge. It was one of the ones that came out. I guess it was like in the mid 2000s, something like that. 2010, let's say, right around then. So it's very similar to what's being made now, or what's being offered to knife makers now. There are a lot of ways in which it was super useful. Really great way was to do bedded tanks. as long as you just gave it that little zap, you could heat the tang and pop it back apart. But you had to be very cautious. I did do 2 different attempts at wootz ingots using the induction forge, and I was 100% unsuccessful. And I feel like there are kind of 2 reasons for that. One, the induction forges that are being offered, they're tuned for heating steel, not for melting steel. So the way that induction works, how it heats the material is based a lot on the frequency of the electricity going through the coil. And higher frequency tends to connect more easily to whatever you put inside the coil, but it also tends to heat the outside much more quickly. Lower frequency is more efficient on large objects. So like industrial melting furnaces, when they do induction furnace setups, they are tuned specifically for melting. Whereas the induction forge, really, quite honestly, you don't want it tuned for melting because you don't want to be melting things.
Sure.
They're made for, really what they're made for is brazing and heat treating. That's what they're made for. They can do a great job for forging, but they're not designed for melting. So my suggestion is, for the melting side of things, I wouldn't bother with getting one of the induction forges. The other thing about it is they don't, at least the one that we had, didn't specifically say that it had a duty cycle, but I think they have a duty cycle. They're not made, again, what they're designed for is, small forging, small heat treating, brazing,
So that's a reference to how long you're running it at high power. Right.
Exactly. So the duty cycle is basically just, how long can you run at a certain power level before it needs a break? Sure. And so, you see this a lot with welders. That's where people would probably be most familiar with it from, is welders very often have a duty cycle rating. So for melting even a relatively small ingot, you're going to be running at full power for a while.
Right.
So, if you happen to have an opportunity to buy a induction machine that is actually designed for melting, then that would. There's no reason it shouldn't work. It might not. It might be a little tricky to get the solidification side sorted out, but
that was going to be my follow-up question.
Yeah, well, because the spacing of the dendrites is largely a factor of how quickly you're cooling. So, like, if we think about the way that they used to produce wootz, they used most of wootz. Most wootz ingots were produced in large batches in a big furnace. Not huge industrial scale furnace, but typically more than a dozen crucibles fired all at the same time. I've seen layouts that indicated up to like 4 dozen.
Wow.
But of course, this was a sketch somebody did based on an archaeological site. So,
okay.
Hard to know for certain. But it is, both from the historical accounts and from the few furnaces that they've found, it's pretty clear that they were producing not one at a time. So they would have a large furnace. It's a big, basically just a big mound of clay that they are then feeding a charcoal fire that is essentially, you're feeding your charcoal fire here, your ingots, your crucibles are here, and the chimney comes out. And so basically you are just have your charcoal fire going, and you are essentially indirectly heating. They probably started off with some charcoal in there, But anybody who has worked with charcoal knows that charcoal is very self-insulating. So like, one side of a piece of charcoal can be white hot and the other side is basically room temperature.
Right.
So if you have your crucibles all packed in the charcoal, it's actually really hard to heat the crucibles because the fire has to be right on them. So instead, most of these were indirect heating. So you would be feeding a charcoal fire, and then the flame and gases, you would continue the combustion. You'd be creating carbon monoxide, which would continue combusting as it goes through the chamber with all the crucibles. Sure. But what you have there is a huge amount of mass. And so they would fire this, it would often be like, a 12-hour firing time. It was a much longer firing time. You had a lot of mass to heat up. And then it might be a couple of days before it would cool enough that they could open it and take those out.
Right.
So they were cooling very slowly. So they very likely got a different structure, than what most folks who are making wootz now get. There are not a lot of original ingots kicking around. There are a few.
Can you imagine if somebody found a hoard of just all these old ingots? Would you want one of those ingots? Right? You'd be like, give me one of those.
I would be very curious, but there's actually there is. I was talking to Timothy Mitchell. He's a bladesmith down in Australia, Buffalo River Forge, and he keeps track of a lot of the developments on the like archaeological scientific front, and he was telling me that. Somebody did actually find, they found a buried trove of, I feel like it was at least 30 ingots. Wow. So it's pretty likely that they were made during, kind of during the transition period while the British were stamping out the industry. So they were made and then they buried them so the British wouldn't find them. And then they were going to dig them up and sell them. Yeah. And the second part just never happened. Sure. It's one of those random things of like, somebody's digging in their backyard and finds random stuff. So hopefully sometime in the next year or two, we'll be getting some good information that those will get analyzed for chemistry. Hopefully we'll see some micrographs showing what the structure of the ingots, what they've got there. My hope also is that they will slice them and do chemistry at various, chemistry and perhaps micrographs at different depths into the ingot. So that could certainly be helpful. But the real struggle that people will have using induction is ramping down, I guess I'll just say correctly, which isn't to say that there's necessarily one specific way that cooling profile needs to go, but it's going to be trickier with induction because you're continuing to put energy into the system versus thermal mass or insulation is slowing the loss of energy from the system. So it's a different thing. And if you have your crucible hyper insulated, it's going to be very hard to get your induction coils to work because they'll be too far separate.
Too far away.
Yeah. I would steer people away from induction. I pursued that for a while. And if you get a machine that can do it, it will absolutely melt that steel, no problem.
I'm gonna pop one of your ingots up. while you continue to talk.
Okay. Yeah, it will absolutely melt the steel, no problem. But there are other complications. It tends to be, the induction forges tend to be fairly expensive. So, there's certainly that consideration. My burner, my diesel and propane burner is made entirely from parts that I bought at the hardware store and the welding supply store. There's nothing complicated in it. If folks go on YouTube, I don't have a specific, like, I've taken apart my burner. Here's what it looks like. But there is the video that I kind of, I ripped off somebody else's design. I modified it to, for what I did, but
Sure.
it's the video is the Quickie oil burner, which I think the guy spelled KWIKY oil burner.
Okay.
I don't know why. I don't know why he spelled it that way, but if you think my videos are dry, just wait till you hear this person talk. It's pretty amazing. But that was my first oil burner was based pretty closely on his.
I see.
The one I'm using now is a bit different, but it's a good starting point, and it's very straightforward.
Sure.
So it's the only thing that makes the oil burner, I guess, a little complicated is you definitely have to preheat your forge or furnace.
Okay.
It does not combust well cold.
Sure.
So I'll preheat to like 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, and then start the oil. And at that point it ignites quite nicely. You get a little bit of smoke until you get the air feed adjusted, but it's simple. The fuel is very available, and it will absolutely get you the temperature you need.
Sure. The next time I come to Hawaii, I definitely want to. When I was at Dragon's Breath, I watched you do several melts, but I never was there side by side with you, like through the whole thing. And I would really love to do that with you next time I'm in Hawaii. I think that
absolutely, man. You got to come over. I know Neil's always telling you to. So,
yeah.
If you don't believe me, believe me.
No. Well, I was there recently. I was there visiting Neil, and I'm glad I got to see you. But I think I would like to come back and have some more focused time with you and making pizza and and Victor riding a cow. No, I'm just joking.
Well, I mean, we'll put him by a cow. How about that? I don't know about riding one of our cows. They're monsters. Not attitude wise, they're not monsters, but they're
large
just
animals.
Big freaking animals. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, they're like 3/4 ton cows. So
yeah,
they're beasts.
I wanted to ask, because I know you love this question, and it is when people say that Damascus pattern welded steel is not real Damascus, wootz is real Damascus. So I would love to hear your take on the quote unquote controversy around those terms. I've kind of talked about it in the past lightly. It's come up on my other podcasts, and talk about how Damascus is more of an umbrella term, and then there are different genres. But still, there are so many people who are just like, no, real Damascus is wootz Damascus.
Yeah. And I mean, so there's a reason why people think that,
Okay.
which is that there is evidence that Europeans coming back from the Middle East talked about Damascus steel, and of course, pattern welded steels were being made in Europe. So it should, if they were talking about pattern welded steels, then why would they bother calling it something different?
Sure.
The thing is, in Damascus, there's evidence that they did produce some crucible steel. It was not probably one of the major production centers. However, it was a big trading city, and they would have traded in all kinds of steel. I guess my problem with the debate is that it's a made-up term. It's a European term. Not to say that obviously, in Syria, they don't call Damascus, whatever the way they pronounce it isn't the way we pronounce it. It's like,
Sure.
Find out recently that Kiev in Ukraine is not Kiev, it's Kiev,
Okay.
So
sure.
Similarly, the people in Damascus, even if we just call it, go ahead and use the European version and call it Damascus, the city, they didn't call the steel Damascus steel. They had very specific names for the different steels that came from different places. So, if you were buying steel that had come from India, that's going to have a very specific name. If it came from Persia or, wherever it came from, or, then they did have pattern welded steels. They also, they worked in all the same bloomery steels that, were used in Europe. So my frustration with that whole debate is that it's basically, it comes down to, is this, slapped on European name the correct slapped on European name, or is this one, this slapped on European name the correct slapped on it ignores the fact that if you actually went to these areas, that's not what they called it.
Right.
So it kind of falls into that that very Eurocentric view of, does it matter what we called it? To my mind, who really cares, as long as the person you're talking to knows what you're talking about.
Sure.
Really it comes down to communication. To my mind, an argument about the exact correct terminology is two nerds fighting over whether Thor's hammer can be picked up by somebody else. I don't really care. It's essentially a non-issue. If you're, if two people are talking to each other and they know what they're talking about, like they're communicating back and forth, then it doesn't matter too much what terms they're using. Personally, I use wootz and Crucible Damascus or Crucible Steel. Wootz is, again, that's not an original local term. It is very likely an English version of one of a few. There are a couple different options that people have said, well, maybe it was this Indian word for steel, or maybe it was this Indian word for steel. It's an English version of an original Indian word for a type of crucible steel. It probably only referred, like the Indian word only referred to one specific process and product. They probably had 3 or 4 different processes and products that would have had different names. But I use wootz because people, whether they're like, oh, that's the wrong term, or maybe they get a little annoyed by it, they still know what I'm talking about. They know that I'm talking about a small batch, very high carbon crucible steel. And and that makes it a very convenient term. Whether it's 100% accurate, I don't worry about that too much. If I say Damascus steel, most people are going to think I'm talking about pattern welded steel. It'll only be those few people, as you said, the ones who are going to instantly hike their shorts up until it's over their belly button, and they're going to be like, no, it's the wrong term, and I'll be like, that refers only to the crucible steel. I'll be like, whatever. I don't get into the argument. Mainly because I feel like it misses the point. It's an argument about the word for something versus an argument about any of its actual characteristics. So, like you, I prefer, I typically use wootz. If I'm going to say Damascus, I'm specific that it's Crucible Damascus, which is handy because that also fits in nicely with, you can have Crucible Damascus, you can have Mosaic Damascus, you can have Laminate Damascus. In that case, the Damascus aspect refers to, it's a patterned product. It's a patterned steel. And if we think about the fact that the other iterations of the word Damascus, so for example, Damascene, it's a patterned, to Damascene steel means that you are, typically engraving it, possibly doing some overlay work on it. There are other uses of the same basic term to describe other patterned things. So I feel like in that regard, Crucible Damascus, some people will just use the term mechanical Damascus to be the umbrella for all the welded, forge welded
interesting.
product.
I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, so that being kind of the main distinction, Crucible Damascus, mechanical Damascus, then mechanical Damascus breaks down into its categories. But the fact is, and again, this is why I try not to get too worked up about the Damascus terminology, is that the wootz or Crucible Damascus wasn't one product. It was, especially, if you look at the fact that it existed for close to 2 millennia, and over a vast region, it stretched, it was over that period, it was produced at various times, all the way from Sri Lanka up into the Caucasus, over into Egypt, into Turkey. It was a large geographic
Caucasus
area.
mean the Slavic countries like Russia.
Right, exactly. So getting into that sort of Central Asia area. And everywhere that it was made, it was different. And, we look at, processes that bladesmiths use right now are different than the processes that bladesmiths used 10 years ago. We've learned, you pick up things from talking to different people. You're like, oh, wow, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. So it's not like it was a static material. It changed over time. It changed across that geography. So the argument of is Damascus, which is the true Damascus, it's a bullshit argument to get into.
It is.
You know.
Well, like I was saying earlier, I think part of my understanding comes from you, and that when people were coming back from, especially to Europe, from Europe back, and acquiring the stuff and then going back to Europe, using Damascus literally as a term as steel products that were purchased in Damascus. That's all it was, is Damascus
Right.
steel. But it like you're saying, there were a lot of very specific different things that just got lumped into one term.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
do think, though, everything that Verhoeven has done to help and learn, and using terms like true Damascus don't help.
No.
Because
No.
there's that documentary, and he refers to wootz Damascus or Crucible Damascus as true Damascus, which again isn't helping anything. And also, again, even just the patterns existed on a spectrum, and so the specific pattern that he was referring to is basically saying that all the other patterns, though they were considered good pattern blades, are somewhat disqualified because, by his definition, they're not the prettiest or the most attractive, so they don't really count.
Well, and that was the pattern that he and Pendray and I think most folks who are doing wootz in various forms, I think most of us are aiming at that that very sheet-like morphology.
Like this.
And I would say it's partly because, for the most part, people think it's the prettiest, and partly people so it's the hardest to make. Of all the patterns, it is certainly the hardest to make. So in that regard, one could see it as the pinnacle. People think it's the prettiest. It is the hardest to make. If one is concerned with performance, it almost certainly is not the highest performance.
Sure.
There's nothing about it to absolutely say that it's poor performance, but that, generally speaking, that very lamellar structure really came to the forefront during the same period that the necessary performance was dropping off. A lot of the blades that have been analyzed that have the best pattern, like the best contrast and the most lamellar patterns, also have the highest phosphorus contents, which isn't to say necessarily that the high phosphorus content and the high the high quality of the pattern, that very vibrant pattern, they don't have to go together, but there is some indication that the phosphorus content contributes to maybe to the ease with which that pattern is made, maybe to how much contrast you get, but even though I was saying earlier, yes, you can get pretty good performance out of a high phosphorus steel. That isn't to say that you couldn't have gotten better performance without the phosphorus. It's more to say that there are ways to work around it, not to say that it's beneficial in any way, which is also a little unfortunate. So there's it's a double-edged sword for the folks who really push that particular pattern as being the ultimate, is that it has also been used by folks who have done tests on those swords, like performance tests, and said, wow, these are shit. These are crap.
These are terrible blades.
What? Yeah.
They're really pretty.
Look gorgeous, but what a garbage material. And I will say it's a narrative that has been pushed pretty heavily by first some of the Russian researchers who were trying to reproduce wootz. So Anisov, I think his name was, did a lot of work. Feel like it was in the 1800s. Did a lot of work trying to develop, sort of a Russian version, which is kind of hilarious because there had been a Russian version, or at least in the southern reaches of Russia, there had been versions of Crucible Steel, because in Georgia, that they had done Crucible Steel there at one point. But in either case, there has been a narrative that the Middle Eastern and Indian steels were inferior steels.
Really?
And that it partly comes from a place of doing tests now, or in more modern times that are centered around more modern performance standards. So I think there is some accuracy to the idea that, like, if you compared one of the antique wootz blades to a modern, like if I made a sword from L6, I would expect the L6 sword to outperform an antique wootz sword.
Sure.
It would be kind of unreasonable not to expect that.
Sure.
If we haven't learned anything in 300 years of metallurgical development, there's something really wrong. But it also ignores the fact that that narrative is typically based on a pretty narrow sample. It's based on this idea that, oh, well, these are the blades that everybody held up as being the best. We've tested some. They were not that great. It ignores the fact that for centuries, wootz or crucible steel swords were outperforming everybody else's swords. So, there's always a little bit of digging to do to find, where's the actual truth in this? Mm-hmm. Where is the actual highest performance? Very likely it was not in, I think we can pretty much guarantee the highest performance wootz was not the wootz that folks like Verhoeven and Pendray were holding up as, this is the one true Damascus. Yeah. So that narrative of the one true Damascus, A, it's kind of false, and B, it casts a shadow on not just all the other patterns, but on the fact that this one true Damascus was not the performance pinnacle. It may have been the aesthetic pinnacle. And the two are very different things. Right. The performance pinnacle could have been centuries earlier. Who knows? It's very hard to know because we have so few blades existing. And mm-hmm. The blades that are in good shape are much too valuable to go out and hit things with.
What?
So, right, I know. And like, even like the material I'm making, I've made swords from it. I have essentially a little saber blade. It's a think it's a 26, 27 inch saber that, yeah, that I use for trimming trees and clearing fence lines, and I beat the crap out of it, and it's doing great. The only time that I've damaged the edge was when I was clearing a fence line and hit a rock, and you kind of expect that the edge of a sword is going to take some damage when you hit a big volcanic rock with it.
Weird. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think your point about particularly Verhoeven and Pendray, that's why I was saying Pendray was a good salesperson.
Yeah.
He was a very good salesman. He and also Verhoeven to some degree, they wanted their accomplishment to be as important as possible. And so part of that is you talk up the thing that you've made.
Sure.
And it has been unhelpful in just moving the conversation forward. I think that it was, what they did was a major accomplishment. And like I said, Verhoeven is still, he's still active in wootz research. I've heard some rumors that he and Nico Heinonen have a paper in the works regarding Nico's steel, which, by the way, anybody who's interested in wootz and Crucible Steel, you should go check out Nico's what he's doing. He's not informative. He's not an informative guy, but he's making very cool steel.
It's pretty exemplary. Sure.
Yeah, it's very, very much worth checking out. He's also he's following a very different line of inquiry than, well, I shouldn't say very different, but a different line of inquiry than Pendray and Verhoeven did. So I'm curious to see what comes out with that. What comes out of that little collaboration.
Sure.
But yeah, I definitely. There are aspects of the Pendray Verhoeven articles that they gloss over things. They are very focused on we want to produce this specific type of pattern, and I think that they. Their theory of vanadium being the underlying source of their pattern, anyways, is I feel like they proved it pretty well, but it's probably not the underlying source of all patterns, and I can say from experience that you can put a little bit of vanadium in your steel and it doesn't automatically get you that pattern. The important part of the process actually isn't that little bit of vanadium. It's all the stuff, all the process that goes around it.
Sure.
The chemistry of the steel is important, but it is only one of a number of variables. And I would say the chemistry is not the most important variable. If you read their articles, the chemistry is, the focus.
Sure.
And I, the stuff I'm working on right now also follows a different line of reasoning anyways than what they did. And I think the evidence so far is that the chemistry is a factor, but not the most important factor.
Sure.
So yeah. Did I run around that question enough times?
That was great. Look, I'm not here to make you say anything you don't want to say. So
no, I guess not so much that. I just I partly there is the issue of I have a lot of respect for the work that Pendray and Verhoeven did. I also
Sure.
have 20 years of frustrated rereadings of their articles, realizing what's left out of them and what's not explained.
Sure.
And there's a lot of that.
Yep.
It's in some ways they say they illuminate less than they show to still be dark. It's like it's a flashlight shining into a dark room, and all the flashlight really does is it points out one thing and tells you that the rest of it you can't see. And that's what their articles are like.
Yeah.
So
it's weird. They're almost coded kind of in a way too, because I feel like every time I go back and read them, I catch something or understand something differently from the previous read.
Yeah. And I think one thing for folks who are interested in making crucible steels and specifically, if they're looking to make more traditional wootz, if you look at the amount of vanadium and other carbide forming elements that are in the steel, in that old steel, and also in the steel that Pendray was making, we're looking at the top end of that is like 0.01% vanadium. Most of them had less than that. So sure. very small amounts of vanadium. And what you can take away from that is that while the vanadium might be the seed of the pattern, the vast majority of the pattern that we see is just made from iron carbide. It's so the real force behind the pattern is actually just the carbon content. If you look at the phase diagram for a given carbon content, it will tell you have to have this much carbide. So no matter what you do, it's going to be in there. And that there's a very, they made a very strong argument that the vanadium helps to organize that. They did not make a strong argument that the vanadium is going to organize it into sheets. It's something else happens there. It's kind of, we went from, hey, there's vanadium in the steel, it helps make carbides. Hey, look, we've got pattern that's in this sheet-like morphology. Vanadium, it is like, well, we just jumped. We went from point A to point D, skipping the 2 points in between, and it's. I can't say that they didn't know. I feel like the two options are they didn't know, so they glossed it over, or they did know, so they glossed it over. And that's, I kind of either way, that's a little, it's frustrating, for somebody like me who is making material and I go back and read those articles because they are a good resource. I don't go back and read them to get annoyed, but it is often the outcome. I'll go back and read them and they're like, man, I wish they had this piece of information in here. It seems like a key piece of information.
Sure.
They talk about, you roast your ingot and the elements diffuse. well, what's the actual diffusion rate of vanadium in steel? I never saw that in the articles. Maybe there was one that I missed. Articles it's a sad thing. Scientific articles are actually getting harder and harder to get your hands on.
Yeah.
More and more of them are behind paywalls on websites. It's a frustrating thing.
Yeah.
And I would be curious to know whether the people who wrote the articles actually get any of that money. Does Springer Link send money?
I would be curious too, honestly.
Yeah, because I guess my feeling is, if yes, they're getting some money, then that's great. I kind of feel like they're not. That's my guess. You should get Verhoeven on and ask him that.
What's the deal? You getting paid, man?
Yeah. What's the deal with that?
I have a few pictures of your work before we call it a show. I want to just show a few pictures of your work, and I was hoping that you could describe the items. So we're going to start with your double-bladed axe.
Yes, that was a fun one. So so this would be mechanical Damascus. This is I actually did a couple versions of this. I think actually 3 versions of this particular design. So it's just a nice raindrop pattern. And fun fact about it, there really weren't historical axes that looked like this. This definitely goes to the more fantasy side of things.
It's too bad. It's a good looking shape.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is I even when I do non-historical pieces, that functionality aspect, I always try to make sure that's still in there. So make sure that it's a historical weight. Most historical weapons were a lot lighter than we've been led to believe. So like I'm pretty sure that this axe, if I'm remembering correctly, even with the handle on it, it was less than 3 pounds total.
Oh wow!
So it was a freaking laser. So because those were like 8 inches in a straight line, point to point across each blade.
Wow!
It was about 11 inches edge to edge, 11 to 12 inches edge to edge, if I recall. So it was not a small axe.
No,
but it was speedy.
This is almost so this is almost kind of a mix between a felling axe and like what else? I want to say medieval, but maybe Viking or style or Gimli style.
So actually probably the closest for blade design, you did see similar blade designs, if we just did single bladed. You did see similar blade designs in medieval Europe. Definitely saw similar stuff in the Indian tebar, or some of the variants on the Indian axes. The big difference, though, is that most axes, rather than having a second blade, they would have either a spike or a hammer on the back.
Right. Okay.
That way, you really get that dual functionality. Because a cutting edge is nice, and certainly with an axe, you have a really just devastating concentration of force behind that, because basically all the weight is right behind that edge. But even so, that a cutting edge is not that effective against armor. So if you've got a small hammer or relatively blunt spike on the back, you get to pick what's going to be the better tool for your opponent. Do you want to? Are they unarmored? Sure, let's use the axe. Use the blade side. Oh, they're armored. Let's use the spike or hammer side. Because a lot of the Warhammer designs, the corners of the hammer actually, the corners of the face actually stick out a little bit,
right?
Which was so they would catch on the armor, so that you wouldn't skate off.
Right.
You wouldn't get a glancing blow. You also see that on some crossbow bolts. The heads would have that like 4-pointed tip, and it was so that they would catch on the armor and all the force would be transferred into the person. And a crossbow bolt that's traveling fast enough that you can shoot it through an oak plank. If you put all that energy into a person, so you're probably not going to, if somebody's in full plate mail, you're probably not going to kill them, but you can take them off their horse. And once that person's on the ground, then it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. All right. The next one, I don't know what you would call that.
Oh, well, so this was a remake of the Crusader sword that I did for Forged in Fire. I've had a couple people, since I was on there in the first season, I've had a couple people ask for remakes of that sword.
I see.
Which I've always done it. Each time I do it a little bit different.
Might also be one of those.
This one was somebody looking for a like an early longsword. A lot of the stuff that I've done, especially in swords, kind of falls into a historically plausible category.
Okay.
It's.
I like that, historically plausible.
Well, so just like we have, the wootz swords that remain are just a tiny fraction of the wootz swords that were ever made. The same is true for European swords. So we'll see. There are books that categorize swords. And they kind of assume that all the swords from a given location and a given time period were the same, which they weren't. And actually, Peter Johnson has, some of his work. He, rather than dealing in measurements, he does a lot more with proportions, because he has found that very often, like in a certain set of swords that were made for, either a given army or, they've found as a collection at an armory, the actual dimensions change quite a bit, whereas the proportions remain fairly similar. So if you see the swords, and they're not side by side, they all look pretty much the same. And then you put them side by side and realize that one is 3 inches longer, which of course you're going to want, because people aren't all the same size. You're not going to want to make the same sword for a guy who's 6 feet tall versus a guy who's 5'8". They shouldn't have the same sword.
It's like you and me. I'm 5'8", you're 6 foot.
Yeah. So, it would make sense, and also, and I guess a similar aspect there, aside from the different heights, we have very different builds. It would be a complete waste of your time to, if you used my sword, because my sword should work well for my height and body type. And you're going to make much better use of something completely different. And so to look back at it and be like, oh yeah, swords were all the same, or we can say there was type 12 or whatever it was, and that's what was used in this time period. It's like bullshit. Maybe there was a style, but there was going to be a lot of variation on that style as people came in, the end users came in and either picked among a range of swords or came in and said, hey, I like this style, but can you do this? Can we have it a little different because, I'm the six-fingered man, whatever it is. But that aside, like,
Oh my God.
That's not me.
That's my fault.
Morocco's being attacked.
This is definitely my first time recording a podcast. I had no idea I was supposed to turn that off.
Was that your compressor?
Yeah, I have a bad habit of leaving that. It even actually went off earlier, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I gotta turn that off." But I was in the middle of something else. I completely forgot. Sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just the idea that there'd be all these super similar swords. Yes, again, there'd be prevailing styles, but it was changing constantly because you make one style of sword or hammer or whatever it is, and then the armor changes to protect against it better. So there was a constant churn of designs. And I look at it and say historically plausible in the sense that does something fit with the sword styles that we know about, from a particular time period, and rather than is it based on a specific example, because the specific examples are, most of what we have in good condition were swords that belonged to kings, princes, etc. They're not necessarily a really good cross section.
Right, they weren't. They were more decoration rather than things that were actually used. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, well, there's that. I mean, and some of the swords that there for a while, there were lots of people who were like, "Oh yeah, swords are like 12 pounds. They're huge," and that was because swords made for parades were like super oversized.
Right.
So they were referred to as bearing swords because you would bear it, you would carry it. For ceremonial or parade purposes, to be like, check out my giant sword. Because
it's so huge.
Yeah. I've got this giant sword and check out the size of my codpiece. It's not exaggerating anything. This used to be flat, and then a pretty woman walked by. Sorry.
You're good.
I know this was supposed to be a PG. No, actually, I never asked you what your general rating was supposed to be.
No rating.
So, no rating. I've been trying to keep it pretty clean.
Oh, you don't have to do that. All right, we got one more for you.
Okay.
Wait, hit. There you go.
Oh, yes. The one of the, I guess, two different versions of Zulfiqar that I made. So Zulfiqar was a sword that in stories, mythology, legends. Not, by the way, I'm not trying to dismiss that in any way. It's but in Islamic history, Zulfiqar was the sword carried by, I believe it was Muhammad's brother-in-law. Again, not trying to step on any toes there, but and the idea was that he was using it in battle, and while he was using it, it split, and so it became this two-pointed sword. And he continued using it, and it kind of became, in some sense, his trademark, that he was using the sword Zulfiqar, that with a split tip. And like I said, I've done 2 different versions of it. So this one was based on, kind of loosely based on Indian versions of it, because of course India there for a while was under the Mughals, under the Mughal Empire, which was an Islamic empire, which Mughals, by the way, that was what they called the Mongols when they started heading eastward again. So when they arrived in India, they were called the Mughals rather than the Mongols. But in kind of standard Indian fashion, in India, there's a tendency to make the weapons as scary looking as they can. I've always interpreted this as the I'd rather not fight sort of. If I can make my weapon look so painful that you don't want to fight me, then that's the best outcome. Which I could get on board with that. I feel like a little bit of intimidation is good. But yeah, there are several versions, several historical versions that came out of India that I have seen that are serrated, and they use this very specific style of blade, which you don't actually see a lot of in India. It's a little bit more like the Turkish kilij or kilik blade with that swell to the tip. But yeah, so I did this version, and I also did a probably more historically accurate version, which was a straight sword. So at the time that Zulfiqar would have been used in North Africa, they didn't use curved swords; they used straight swords. So that one I did for an author who was writing a book that is a fictional book, and the sword was a key part of the book, and so he wanted a version of it for himself. But yeah, we talked about it a bit. Why the split tip? Because he was originally asking me, he's like, "Oh, could we do it in wootz?" And I was like, "Well, they, at that time, they didn't. They very likely did not have wootz blades in North Africa, so it would have, everything would have been, either, it would have been a mechanical Damascus of some kind, whether it was actually pattern welded so you could see it, or whether it was, simply a, what some people sometimes refer to as a pile weld, where you've just folded it numerous times to refine it. So if it was a pile weld, then the most likely thing is that it would split on a weld, so the tip would have actually separated this way.
Side to side.
Yeah. So you'd actually have a split that went through that flat plane. And that, none of the reproductions that I've seen did that. Plus, I had a hard time seeing how the sword could possibly be more effective that way, because that was part of the legend of it, or part of the story was that the sword split and now it actually worked better somehow. And I was like, I don't see how a sword that's, that has opened up this way along a weld line works better. Whereas if we assume that it was a little bit more like a Viking construction, so it's actually, a multi-bar construction. Now it makes sense that you can split that, live long and prosper. You can split that blade this way and have 2 points, and it makes more sense how that might be functional, how it would continue to function. And now you've got 2 points. You can still stab people with that. Theoretically, some people have said, "Oh yeah, you catch other blades in there," and I'm like, I don't believe
That'd be quite the catch.
Yeah, well, exactly. Just the leverage is bad.
Yeah.
So I have a hard time with that concept. But yeah, it's that big one. That it was hard to tell the scale. The one with the serrated edges is actually a 36-inch blade. That thing was a monster.
Yeah.
When I got feedback from Sharp by Coop that it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever had to photograph. Just like, wow, that's quite something. Nice. Not sure if I feel good or bad about that. But it was terrifying because I did actually sharpen all those serrations. It was, ugh.
I remember. Very scary. Sketchy.
So
nice.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. More? I mean, we didn't even cover everything. You're gonna have to have me back on at some point, so we can cover more.
For sure. And this is actually, I'm probably gonna split this into 2 episodes. Because that was a good stretch. And actually the audio issues happened like right in the middle, basically.
Oh, good.
So
good.
A good spot.
And that's also when I went to the bathroom, so it's perfect.
But so I just want to thank you so much for taking your time. Like I said, you are a wealth of knowledge. I've learned a ton from you in our various conversations, as well as bouncing ideas off of you. And I just really appreciate you coming in here and sharing some of that knowledge and understanding, especially around the wootz and crucible steels, because that, even though people have been remaking them for a while now, I think it's still very well understood and well known. And I'm excited to see where things go, especially in the next couple of years, because I think you're doing some cool stuff with it, as well as other side projects for sure. And I definitely want to get back out, bring the family out to Hawaii and come hang out, and we'll work and they can go play, and maybe we'll go play too, but mostly we'll probably work, but which is all right with me.
Yeah. I was going to say, at that point, work becomes play, so it's good.
Yeah, for sure.
It's good. And absolutely, I'm happy to come on, and because you are one of my favorite people to have these conversations with. It's there are very few people who who have enough interest that they don't just fall asleep, and
there's a lot to understand.
What's that?
I was just saying that there's a lot to understand. It's not just a mechanism, and then all of a sudden everything happens. You really got to get into the metallurgy. You got to get into all the different parts.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I feel like, both in wootz and also pattern welding, we've had such a great ongoing conversation. I always look to you for my pattern welding inspiration, because I feel like among people currently making, who are doing pattern welding these days, you are, as far as I'm concerned, you're doing the best work. There are,
thank you.
I feel like, there are a lot of people doing really good work these days. Every time you put out a new pattern, every time I'm just like, God damn it. How does this even go together? Where are the seams in this? And that's, I feel like you bring a level of perfection to it that most people just don't. And,
sure.
And a level of imagination to it. As I've said to a lot of people, including you over the years, you look at those patterns in a whole different way than basically everybody else. I've watched you look at a pattern and then look at somebody else's pattern and work backwards in a matter of a few minutes, say,
Sure.
okay, they did this, in reverse order, and go back to the starting bar, and then, all the manipulations along the way. And that's a unique skill, man. That's why I always, anytime I'm like, is this going to work? I talk to you, because
Sure.
you will say, no, Peter, that will not work.
There's just one little thing right here that needs to be tweaked.
Exactly. So,
Well, House Bear Forge has enjoyed the chat. Thank you, Steven. And thank you again, Peter. I appreciate you joining. Thank you, everybody, for your support. If you are listening to this and you didn't get to catch the live stream, go join the Patreon. If you jump in at the illuminated individual level or higher, you'll be able to be part of these conversations. You'll be able to ask questions in the live chat that's going on while we're talking, as well as ahead of time to make sure we get those questions in. So, yeah, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your support. Take care.